Our guest today is Jimmy Parker, and he spent the last 20 years chasing a single question. Why doesn't training actually change behavior? Jimmy is the founder and chief transformation officer at Peak, where he helps organizations create fast, lasting transformation at scale. He's a former Marine Corps attack helicopter pilot and trainer who went on to lead executive development at the Home Depot, and he holds a PhD in developmental psychology applied to organizational transformation. The number that drives his mission is pretty brutal. Research puts the application rate of traditional training somewhere between 0 and 9%. In this episode, we get into his answer, a methodology he calls micro experiences. We talk about why Agile talk so rarely becomes Agile behavior, the difference between knowledge, behavior, and habit, and 2 specific micro experience use cases you can try with your team this week. And we close on something Jimmy cares deeply about, making the kind of deep development usually reserved for executives accessible to everyone. This is episode 6 of Hard Boiled Software with Jimmy Parker. Okay, welcome, Jimmy Parker, to the Hard Boiled Software Podcast. Great to see you, Jimmy.
Thank you, Dave. Super great to be here.
One of the things that really struck me was the research and the kind of care and meticulousness that you put into your POV around micro experiences. So that's what we're here to talk about today. You've a long and storied history in, we'll say, learning and training and stuff like that. Do you want to give us just a quick kind of origins story of how you got to this point?
Sure. Yeah. Spent a little bit of time in the military. Got the leadership bug there. Got really interested in leadership. Tried to, worked really hard at being the best leader that I could. And then that morphed into wanting to actually build the best leaders that I could. And so I started running like leadership training in the classroom and all that stuff, and learned after running hundreds of people through the classroom, thousands even, that traditional training doesn't tend to change on-the-job behavior. And so I started scratching my head, and that led me down the path I'm on now, about 17, 20 years later, of experimentation around and learning around what is it that really drives human behavior change at scale, any kind of behavior change, whether it's technology transformation or any kind of org transformation, or even if you just want to get more fit, and change your own habits and behaviors. Like, how does that process even work? How do you get better at it? And if you want to do the really hard thing of getting other people to change their behavior, how do you become, excellent at that as well? And that's what has sort of led me down the path here.
Nice. So kind of just framing the conversation a little bit, you've been in rooms where everyone says, oh, we're Agile or we're doing this thing, but nothing actually changes. What's the tell, or what kind of cues do you see that this is just theater?
Agile talk.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I think when you just look at the norms of how, an organization leverages its product development, how it goes about building products, designing, developing, delivering them, where requirements come from, how long they take to do stuff, the typical definitions of Agile, but showing up in the actual actions and going back to the behaviors of what they're really doing versus what they're saying. There's often a discrepancy when you look closely. Even something like OKRs, a great example. There's lots of OKR zealots out there who swear by them. Say, okay, show me your goals. And you bounce those against, the best practices on how OKRs should be defined and tracked and all that stuff. And, I've got my own scoring system, and most people get a D or a C at best, even the people who teach OKRs, when you look at their own goals. And so, there can be a pretty big delta between what we aspire to and what we're actually doing.
How willing are you to change your behavior, right? It kind of becomes one of the limiting factors. Like, we've learned that engaging with teams, we can do that all day long. But if we're not also engaging with leaders along the way, it almost makes it a certainty that team layer engagement, even if it's like a longer 6-week thing, is going to be fruitless.
Yeah. And that's what's really intrigued me is a lot of technology teams, intact teams, they have a lot of great resources and training and coaches and consultants like you and your team who can really help them change how they operate, their ways of working on a day-to-day basis within that frontline team, product team. And oftentimes those teams, when they start to get some traction, run into some real cultural barriers outside of that team, particularly with the executives that lead those teams or the cross-functional executives that say technology has to report to, or your your key business partners, stakeholders that oftentimes would be prescribing requirements. They don't understand Agile, and they're leading in ways that are contrary to Agile, product development methods and ways of deploying technology. And that becomes a real governor, limit it to whether, they stay a cost center for that organization or an actual new source of value generation for that company, that can really accelerate strategy, that it matters all the way up to the CEO, not just, the CTO. And so that's been my specialty here as I've gravitated toward executives, executive development, changing executive level behaviors on the job and helping them see and understand and adopt Agile mindsets, Agile behaviors, and how dramatically different it is from, the types of mindsets and leadership behaviors that have helped them get very successful, and even to where they are. Sometimes they have to jettison some of that stuff and it can be scary for them. Just helping them navigate through that process has been sort of a passion of mine because I believe in Agile and believe in what it can do. And I've seen it be really limited by people outside of technology, particularly those more senior leaders.
One of the things that stands out on your CV is your experience as a TAC helicopter pilot and trainer. And I just have to ask because it's so, interesting looking for someone that's on the outside of that world. But is there anything from that kind of pretty rigorous and safety critical domain that has translated into the corporate world? Going back to...
Oh, yeah, for sure. I think one of the biggest things is that the military has a pretty low tolerance for things that don't work in general. You got a very specific job, to do, and things have to be effective. They have to work or else, they don't last. And so that really has stuck with me as I've transitioned out of that world and into the world of behavior change and leadership development and executive coaching and all that kind of stuff. Like, if it's not impactful, if it's not actually making a difference, and behavior change is just step one of that difference, you got to, see if those behaviors actually manifest into creating more value or creating the kind of organizational outcomes you want, helping execute strategy better, right? If it's not effective at doing those meaningful things, then it can be just theater. It can be just talk, or maybe it's a training program that's just a perk for people, to sort of go through and tickle their brain, but it doesn't actually make much of an impact. And so I've held on pretty tightly to that and held myself accountable, not just for teaching the right things, but for really equipping people at scale to be able to do the right things and overcome the barriers to doing, even when they know what to do.
Yeah. So kind of a cohesive set of principles that match the then to the now. That's what I'm getting.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's kind of spend some time framing up the problem for our listeners here. Like, I'd like to kind of unpack why traditional fixes don't work. And I'm thinking 5-10 years ago, it was really common to see, these big training and certification giant frameworks kind of being deposited from the mothership onto people and process compliance and all this stuff. Like, I guess, that motion, right? Where do these things actually help, or where do they fall down in your
Yeah, I think for the most part, most of those solutions, trainings and certifications, workshops, what they're designed to do is to transfer knowledge into the people who go through those courses. And there's a fundamental assumption there that if people knew different, they would do different. And that's true in some cases, but not all cases. It's true in simple cases. Like if you don't know what an OKR stands for, right?
Yeah,
and
right.
you've never made one, right?
Right.
Learning what an OKR is and what good looks like, having some examples and maybe a template, right? Yeah, can really help you, sort of do different. That's the simple version. But to really implement an OKR and get it aligned with other key stakeholders and other OKRs above or below you in the food chain, or aligned with key stakeholders that you're dependent upon to achieve your OKR, like that's all organizational systemic stuff. It's very complex, not simple at all. And a workshop oftentimes can't help you do that. And so it's a case where people knew different, but they can't quite do what they learned because of other barriers. So knowledge gaps are really easy to plug with training, and that's the appropriate way to do it. It's a very efficient way to do it. And if you get the behavior change just by plugging a knowledge gap, great, stop there. We live in a complex world, and that's often not enough. And that's where training on its own tends to really fail to drive adoption, on-the-job action, application, and certainly enough reps to build habits.
Yeah, totally agree with that. For us, it's like we kind of use that mental model of explicit versus tacit knowledge. And like a lot of the trainings that I had done in the prior world were really aimed at like tacit knowledge things, like really,
Right.
how do you do good design and software engineering, right? Like you can't slideware your way to that. You actually have to
Right.
get in a practice environment and do deliberate practice and work through that. And it's a much longer engagement, and it's much more predicated on people's real problems and needs and that kind of thing. So yeah, I totally agree. It also suffers though from the problem is it doesn't scale very well. Like when you're kind of engaging with people weeks at a time, yeah, you'll get the behavior change, but you're going to see this fraction of the organization. So it has a huge trade-off associated with it. I wonder why. I just wrote this down. I don't know. It's a little flip, but why does the industry suck at behavior change? Like, why do you think we're not able to change behaviors, change cultures the way that we would like to, like when we incept these initiatives?
Well, I think it's because it's hard. It's a legitimately hard thing to do in many cases because the world is complex, and the things that can inhibit sticky behavior change are many. There's lots of different things. We've mentioned knowledge gaps just for the individuals. Let's say I want to be more fit than I am. You can immediately come up with a half a dozen different things that might be getting in my way of that. And that's just to try to change me. Now you talk about a team working together and changing how they interact with one another. That's exponentially more difficult to change patterns of behavior and ways of working and norms and culture inside of a team. Then you magnify it to a whole organization, cross-functional, right? That you need to create a really strong value creation, product development, technology development, system going. And it's a third order of complexity, and so it is really, really hard. There's lots of different things that kind of get in the way. Training is often our go-to move, and trainers, instructional designers, who build these trainings, what do they design? They design instruction. They assume that's a knowledge gap. They plug those knowledge gaps and then hope everything else will work out. But there's lots of science outside of L&D, outside of instructional design around behavior change. There's tons of great stuff around habit science, behavior management. I've gone to lots of different places to learn more about this craft, even things like addiction recovery, religious conversion, when you just study that and how that works, changing deeply rooted values and behaviors, what works, what doesn't work there. Great marketers understand something about changing consumer buying behavior. They have tactics, tried and true. So these different industries have figured out in their own way how to change behavior in more effective, more efficient ways than others. And I was just this L&D guy that got, really frustrated with the fact that what I was doing in the classroom wasn't translating to the real world. And I'm like, how do we get better at this? And so that sparked this pretty intense period of study and practice and my own experimentation to measurement, honestly, to see what was actually working and what wasn't, and just trying to craft an approach that I call micro experiences today that is sort of the best of all those worlds.
Yeah, let's get into the micro experience thing. Yeah, you really lead with the word experience. And when we were first kind of, spitballing, around topics for the podcast and all that, you really guided me away from using the word learning to the word experience that describes what you're doing. Can you help me kind of unpack, like, why do you lead with experience? What does it mean to you? Why is that a precise term for you?
Yeah, well, this is really a big problem when we're talking with L&D people. Your audience is less so. It's more focused on technology, but still there's a tendency to want to reach for learning first. And it goes back to what I was saying, just assuming that there's a knowledge gap, assuming that if people knew different, they would do different. If we plug that knowledge gap, it would translate to behavior change. That's the assumption that I'm trying to actually put under a microscope and bust for people. So the model of learn first, then hope that we do it is one way of learning, and it's good for certain things, simple things, but it's not necessarily very good for very difficult things when there's a lot of other barriers to behavior change. And there are certain things you can only learn by doing. You cannot learn from a classroom, right? I loved your framing of explicit knowledge versus tacit or implicit knowledge. And, there's fancy terms for this, in the education world, but essentially you've got what's called declarative knowledge, which is that explicit learning that you can teach somebody else, knowledge transfer, that kind of a thing. And then this implicit stuff, the explicit is learning what to do and how to do it. The implicit stuff is all the contextual nature of how you apply that in the real world. It's when to apply it and when to not to. It's understanding your stakeholders and how to approach them with it. It's understanding, hey, out of these 7 steps in the process, how to adapt those steps to your unique product or team or context or customer or whatever. We can skip step 6 here, or getting creative, and being able to adapt what you've learned maybe from the classroom or a certification to the actual needs that are in front of you, and not just doing the same thing, sort of every time like a robot. That kind of contextual knowledge and the ability to adapt the explicit knowledge in a tacit way usually is only learned, or is at least learned best, by trying it and seeing what happens and adapting. That's experiential learning. That's leading with experience, doing, applying, reflecting on that experience to understand what worked, what didn't, and then adapting going forward. It's sort of the agile way, but as it relates to learning itself and how quickly you're able to figure out what's effective and what's not.
It's interesting. It really sounds like experience is the journey, and learning, maybe it's not the destination, but there's little waypoints along the way is kind of how I'm thinking of it, of your model.
Yeah. I mean, even in simple terms, you may have heard this question. Do we think ourselves into a new way of acting, or do we act ourselves into a new way of thinking? Well, the answer is both, and it depends. One method works better in certain situations. The doing first and then acting ourselves into a new way of thinking is often an underutilized approach. And that's what I have chosen to sort of focus on and lead in, because it can help you solve behavior change problems that are the most difficult to change in ways that, a class or a certification could never do.
Yeah. Yeah. I just think even like in a class, you're going to have this curve of promoters and detractors, right? People that are like, okay, I'm here, I'm doing it, I'm checking the box, but no way am I ever going to bring this back to my environment. And then you have people that are like super like ready to apply it and like zealous about what they're learning and want to kind of apply it really quickly. And I feel like even that like distribution, if we focus on experience, we're going to be able to pull those detractors toward a willingness to try or something like that, just at a in a group learning situation. But
I'm actually glad you mentioned that, because just to throw some numbers out, if you actually examine when people come out of a class or a training or a certification,
yeah,
what percentage of those people actually apply what they learned in the classroom on the job, in the way that they are intended to? And the research varies, but the percentage of people who actually do apply it properly the way it's intended is between 0% and 9%. That's usually like industry best is 9%. And that's from studies from Harvard, from MIT, just a lot of the big names. And that was the number I was chasing, for the past 20 years of how do we get that application number at 90% or better?
Yeah. That's
what works to get that number up there.
Yeah. That's fascinating. I used to do the classic training thing, and I would always I called them spiritual warriors, but I'm like, how many spiritual warriors did I create, around test-driven development or, DevOps stuff or whatever. And it was like 20 people, in these classic training courses, which I could control a lot there, my performance, the content, a lot, and you get really good vanity metrics. But I, the people coming back to me and saying, hey, look at this, Dave, takes me to their computer and show me what they're working on. And it's like an adaptation of that would be, I was thinking 2 or 3 was the good number. And I'm like, wow, this is really depressing. Because when you push past those attendance things or instructor preparedness or the kind of classic, what does this survey measure, questions, the real meaning was always really quite depressing, But yeah, that totally tracks with my experience. All right. Yeah. So one little just thing I want to dig into in your model is because, we are filling knowledge gaps here in this podcast, is like you distinguish among like knowledge, behavior, and habit, right? And I would love to kind of understand light definition, how these things interact in your model. Just kind of define those terms before we get into some examples.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have a super sophisticated definitions. I think they're pretty straightforward, knowing is what you can sort of recall and spit facts you can spit back out, like the proverbial Jeopardy champion, that's somebody who just knows a lot. But that can be different from, kind of what they do. A good example there is most people know how to be more fit than they are. I shared that one earlier about myself,
Sure.
So there's a gap there maybe between what I know to do and what I'm actually doing, my behavior. I would include speech in the behavior bucket. So when you look at how maybe a team communicates with one another, how they handle conflict, the stuff like that, and the language itself, I would put that under behavior category. And then behavior can be measured discretely. Did you do it or did you not do it? Yes or no right now in this instance kind of a thing. But are you doing it consistently without thinking? Habits go through stages of, I'm not doing it. I'm not thinking about it. And then I'm thinking about it because I took a class or whatever, but I'm not yet doing it. Now I'm having to do it on the job, but it requiring a heavy cognitive load for me to overcome old habits and, break those barriers. And then you need reps doing that until you can start doing it without thinking about it. And that's when it's become habitualized. And that's when it's really reaches the status of a habit that's taken root, and understanding that progression from ignorance on a topic all the way through to really building what's called unconscious competence, right? You're doing it without having to think about it consciously. That's a journey, and it takes a certain amount of time. It takes a certain amount of effort, and that has to be baked into any intervention if you really want to get there at that outcome.
Interesting. Okay, great. Yeah. Let's dig in. Really kind of love to expose your method for our listeners and kind of just understand, by way of concrete examples, how does this system you've developed work?
Yeah, I usually find that it's best to lead with a couple of examples of what a micro experience is. And then from there, we talk about how you operationalize that into more of a program that drives behavior change at scale. I got a couple examples here that might be a little bit more relevant for this audience. And there's a couple one-pagers that I'll often reference. So is it okay if I just read those?
Yeah, go for it.
Let's see. One of them is for a product team who is, like I mentioned before, they've taken the course. They are taking steps toward Agile. They're starting to change their ways of working. They're getting traction on that. They're doing better quality retros and sprint planning and racking up some wins, starting to do better at that. But they're finding that they're either their reporting chain or other people in the organization that are more senior, the executives there, they haven't adopted these Agile mindsets. And they're asking things of these teams that are sort of counteracting or maybe even stripping away their autonomy that they were taught they should have, to really maybe decide what to build and what's going to be most valuable for the organization, that kind of thing. So if you're a team like that, this would be maybe a single micro experience that would be relevant. I call it the judo move. Whenever you're in the role of an order taker, most don't want to be order takers, right? They want to be more of a deciders of what they kind of build, but oftentimes you get served up a bunch of features that, you need to build without any knowledge about what the problem is those features are trying to solve or the benefit for the customer or whatever. And, you're being expected to just take orders and deliver these orders without that knowledge. And so we've got a little one-pager that says, here, try these judo moves whenever you receive an order that helps allow you and give you the information you need to track better. One of them is, and it's just a bunch of responses that you can make to a key stakeholder, wherever you pick, the ones that would work well for you. One of them is, got it. Yeah, we can build those features. Let's fast forward and say we built those features to perfection. What benefits do you expect that they'll have for our user? And then you see what they say. There can be some follow-ups. Or another one is, okay, that's helpful. I can make some assumptions about how that might benefit us or the business. But it would be great to hear it in your words. So now we're getting the customer benefit, the user benefit, the business benefit. We're starting to round out the why and the problem we're trying to solve, that kind of a thing. Or help them think through the problem that they should be solving with these features. And then you can get to a place where hey, if you think that your team might be able to come up with a better solution or a better set of features that would solve their core problem or the user's core problem even better than the features that were requested. Hey, would you be open to that if we were able to make some alternative solutions or recommendations? Yes or no? These are just ways of sort of poking and prodding whenever you're sort of forced back into this order taker mode to get out of that mode and to get more into a value creation kind of a space and see, whether they'll let you do that or not. Some will, some won't. Most of them are open to it if you ask them the right way. That's just one example you could have a team, try to do to start to combat some of the organizational norms outside the organization. I got a second one, but it looks like you might have had a comment on that one.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think that this one pushes the requester to think more about the outcomes, the benefits. Yeah. Super, super handy. Is there anything that goes with this? It's almost like you can model this as just a little tiny flow chart, right? Or just a set of prompts, like you said. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there?
Yeah.
And what else goes with it? I mean, do you then provide like as a third party, like coaching around this or accountability partnership, or like there's certainly the knowledge, like here's the judo move, right? Here's some prompts you can use
Right.
in this situation. Do you hold people accountable for trying that out or reflecting on the results of that? Like how does that those behavior choices and prompts shift to habit in your practice?
Yeah. So you're getting into how do we operationalize something like a micro experience? Like I was just reading off of a one pager. And so if I were to give this micro experience to you or someone in a micro experience program or, an Intact work team, this would be within the context of a single week. We'd give you this one pager, this resource here. And then we'd ask you to go through a cycle, a 4-step cycle in a week. The first thing is to adapt that micro experience to your situation, your client, your customer, your type of team, the type of product you're building, whatever it is, right? You take what's written and you go, this doesn't really apply to me. I want to change the verbiage. I'm going to ask these different questions, whatever, but you stick with the spirit and the intent of what you're trying to do, but you're adapting it and you're shaping your own journey on what you are learning and what kind of skills you're building. Also to reflect what skills you've already built and what's really going to get you out of your comfort zone, maybe, or push the needle a little bit more. That's the first step, is adapt. The second thing is actually do it. So you actually had this conversation, where you're pushing back or asking these probing questions or whatever. And so that might involve, scheduling a meeting or whatever. The third piece is to reflect on what happened when you did it. And every micro experience is paired with a reflection question. And there's some design guidelines that go into a good quality reflection question that's meant to help you examine your own experience, your own life. Because again, highly regarded as the father of experiential learning, John Dewey said, 100 years ago, we don't really learn from experience. We learn from reflecting on that experience in the right way. And there's ways of doing it right, and there's ways of doing it wrong. And so the reflection question is designed to leverage best practices around learning from living, learning from your own real world lived experience in ways that can draw more insights out of that action than if you hadn't thought about it or reflected on it at all. That's the third step. Those first 3 steps you do on your own or as a team. Adapt it to your situation, do it, reflect on it. And then there's the last piece is a collaboration piece where there's actually a conversation about what you did. And this is an example for maybe an entire team to do, or imagine it's a bunch of product managers going through a micro experience program. And so they're asking separate questions. They're adapting it to their own unique teams, but then they come together and we put people in like small groups of 5 or 6 people who had this experience. They did the same thing that week. And what we find is each person oftentimes learns something different from doing and reflecting on the exact same micro experience. And so not only is each person learning from their own experience in an accelerated way, because now we're leveraging what the best of the best do in the planet to become best in the world at. And that's where all this stuff comes from. They're learning from their own experience, but now I get to learn from Dave's experience and Carol's experience, and 4 or 5 other peers. And that becomes an accelerant to everybody's learning. And that's a simple 1-hour meeting that also is constructed in a fairly lightweight way, but a powerful way to activate growth mindsets and psychological safety to maximize the learning impact of that discussion. And that's 1 week of a micro experience program. And then that cycle repeats with a different micro experience that you kick off the second week with, and you go through that same cycle with a different micro experience. I can give you another example of one in just a second, but that's how we operationalize it.
That's so cool. So there's this I love that it ends with this kind of collaborative jam session. That's where you get a little feedback loop established in there.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, cool. Let's get into example 2, and I'll maybe
Sure.
have some more process
Example
questions.
1 was for like a technology team or a product team, in-tech team. But let's say there's a company that's recognizing that they have this corporate initiative that matters outside of technology to become a more nimble, agile organization, more resilient organization, more innovative organization. It's a CEO priority, which means it's inherently cross-functional. And there's an awareness that older or more outdated leadership paradigms or project management ways of working, the old-fashioned predict and control, make these big plans and try to stick to your plan, like those are getting in the way of being an agile, nimble organization cross-functionally or whatever. And so now the problem is getting mindsets and behaviors to change cross-functionally, not just with a technology team, And so this second example, this is really for executives that might be like reluctant to grant autonomy to a product team, or to hand down decision rights, maybe on what to build or something like that. I call this the decision audit. And this would be for those executives, many of which have been handsomely rewarded by leading in project management ways, non-agile project management ways. They've been very successful. And so it works well for them. So it can be kind of scary. And so this is a safe to try kind of a thing. But imagine this micro experience being implemented by executives outside of the technology department, in your company. And this one's pretty simple. It's not actually a one page, it's just a paragraph. For 1 week, track the decisions that you personally like. This is an executive now. What decisions you personally make, including approvals. Take 5 minutes at the end of each day, reflect on your meetings and decisions that day, and then score each decision on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is clearly mine to own. 5 is somebody else could have or should have made this. Really simple. And then at the end of the week, reflect on those decisions that you made that other people should have or could have, and look for patterns in why you made that decision anyway, even though you yourself have said it would be better for somebody else to make it. And then identify one decision-making behavioral shift next week. So you can see there's intentionality here. There's using my real world experience. There's reflecting on my own behavior and unpacking what's good and bad, what I like or don't like about that, and then engaging them in, an ideal next step, which is usually pretty obvious if they go through this kind of an analysis, and sort of quantifying things on this 1 to 5 scale can really help bring to the surface a lot of bad habits they didn't even realize they had. And then again, imagine not only, one of your problematic business stakeholders doing this, right? And the insights that might come from them doing it. Imagine if you've got 10 of these problematic stakeholders, right? And they get in a couple of different small groups and they have a discussion about what they experienced and what they learned and the insights that they had, especially if they're in conversation with you, the product team, right?
Right.
And how you might, and they invite a question, how can we give you more autonomy in ways that would work really well? But this kind of a decision audit can surface things like, I don't trust that they're going to make the right decisions. I trust myself better than others. Well, why don't I trust, right? It can lead to some really deep insights around that. Maybe the team isn't legitimately skilled enough. They're talking agile, but they're not doing agile. And the executive sees that. And so they don't trust that they're actually going to do it the right way, right? There's all kinds of things that this kind of real simple decision audit can surface, both for single individuals, but also for, deeper conversations between dependent stakeholders to help take meaningful steps at breaking down some of these barriers to actually operating more agile, nimble, flexible ways.
Interesting. Dude, we could use this all over the place. It's super relevant. So in this one, we talked about like the kind of group coming together and sharing how it went for them or their insights or, how their adaptations, like essentially how they use this. In this one, would you pair this with like some kind of executive coaching one-on-one type session? Like does the process change as the audience maybe becomes a little bigger in ego or busier in time, or is this a different demo?
It can, but it doesn't have to.
Okay.
So I have a sort of a core set of defaults for what constitutes a micro experience program. I've covered most of it, but not quite all of it, right? You got this 1 micro experience a week. You've got this 4-part cycle that you complete in that week with that 1 micro experience, which includes a group meeting. So you're putting people into small groups of 5 or 6 people. A piece I haven't mentioned yet is that small group meeting is facilitated by a facilitator or coach of some kind.
Okay.
And in my case, this is importantly not a certified facilitator, a certified agile person necessarily, or anything like that. It can be, it certainly can be. And you might get extra juice out of that. But in most of my programs, we're going for massive scalability, like cross-functionally kind of a thing. So we need we need way many more coaches than we have. And so the frameworks and the methods that I've sort of ironed out over the years are designed to reduce the facilitation and coaching skill level required to get good results. You can even take a moderately skilled facilitator or coach, plug them into this micro experience program. We give them about 2 hours of training, and there's some job aids and stuff like that. We get good results pretty consistently. So there is that component, and they have an extra role around making sure that the meeting is conducted, in ways that follow the best principles to drive the right kind of, not just awareness, but also behavior change, habit adoption, and a supportive kind of a network. Yeah. And then I think I answered your question there. That's most of sort of the core components of how we bring everything to life and operationalize it.
Do you ever encounter things where people sign up or get enrolled in one of these micro experience, initiatives, and they just don't do the work? Does the experiment fail for lack of trying, or What's that like? Or do they generally
Yeah.
follow through? Yeah.
Yeah. What you're getting at is engagement levels. I go back to that process of going from ignorance on a topic, to knowing and then doing enough to become a habit. That's a process that requires a certain amount of effort. Getting out of your comfort zone and trying difficult things and getting some reps in. And in order for you to have 90% success rates, which is typically what we get with our micro experience programs, the behavior manifests on the job, 90% of the people, you have to pay attention to engagement levels. Like, how engaged are they coming into a program and starting up, or why are they even want to be in the program? There's opt-in versus opt-out design choices on, who gets who gets to be in a program like this. And when you're forcing it on people, you're going to have more people that are sort of prisoners, checking the box, and you're not going to get as high success rate. And then that's one of many factors we've identified over the years that can maximize engagement levels and the effort that they're willing to put into a program that obviously just gives you better results, coming out of it. Executive sponsorship and buy-in. There can be incentive systems that are built in to completion of a program like that. We have accountability measures during the program. So if somebody's engagement does start to drop off, something does actually happen. This is all in the coach training that we give people to anticipate, the right things to look for, what to say and do when something starts going off the rails. But that tends to be more of the fringe edge cases, the exception and not the norm these days.
You got my wheels turning. So it sounds like this, on face value, the micro experiences look simple, but that simple ain't easy thing, it's kind of coming around. Like the way you design the program, the way you kind of train the facilitators, the way you craft these questions, that is the hard part, right? Is kind of designing those programs.
Yeah, that's kind of really the secret sauce that makes things work.
Okay. And, you mentioned these are scalable, and I can kind of get that. I'm going to reckon they're scalable from a time commitment. They slot into otherwise busy calendars. Everyone's, busy is the new stupid, that kind of thing. And they take smaller portion of time and yield an outsized effort. I'm going to guess what you mean by scalability.
Well, it's scalable strictly in terms of how much they cost to run, because a program that's very expensive isn't scalable because you can't give it to everybody that you need to, especially if we're talking about, large scale cross-functional major org transformation work where hundreds or thousands of people, need to have this experience. So how costly the program is a big part of it. And then the second part of scalability is how much overhead it requires to run. If it's your L&D staff or your product team or whatever, designers that are sort of running and administering a program like this, there's some administrative overhead to, getting people into a program like this, to running a program like this. There's a lot of data that a program like this gets produced. There's metrics, effectiveness metrics. Somebody's got to do that work. And in many programs like this, that administrative overhead is often underestimated, and they realize when they get into it, man, I need 3 people just to run this program, administer it, not including the people who are in it. And so scalability in my case has turned into these, when you really develop the capacity to build high quality micro experience programs internally, you learn, and I have a certification where I teach people how to design, develop, deliver micro experience programs at scale. The cost becomes about 1/10 of traditional training. So now you can touch 10 times more people, with it. And then I've had as many as 30,000 people in a micro experience program at one time. And that only required just over one person's time, full time, to run. So very, very light overhead in terms of administrative burden. Once you understand how to run these programs, they are extremely scalable. You can touch thousands of people quite easily, once you learn how to do them.
That's awesome. So in your consulting company's Peak.co, we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, Peak. But how are you engaging with clients to launch these, to create these micro learning initiatives? Like, is it a combination of let me run a pilot and then, or do you build like capability internally so they can DIY? Like, do you do public certifications? Like, how do people learn about this or, acquire this skill?
Yeah, my go-to initial offering is generally I help build micro experience program for this, handcrafted. So all my stuff is custom designed to the strategy of that organization, to the culture of that organization. using the common language of that organization. And so it really feels like a program that was built by them, for them, kind of a thing, not by some outside cookie cutter, because I don't have any off-the-shelf solutions that I'm selling these days. I found they don't work very well. So it starts with a custom program, minimum of 3 months long. You need at least 3 months to start to get the real behavioral and organizational impacts that you're after. You need at least 3 months to do that. And at most 6 months. I have a limit. I won't do a micro experience program any longer than 6 months, because I've learned that there's an intentionality when you're in a program like this, doing this every week, where people can use a break around at that 6 month mark. You are asking them to get out of their comfort zone. You are asking them to devote more effort to this sort of learning and growth and behavior change. And there are real limits to how much you should ask, sort of people. And so if a client wants to do a 4-month, 5-month program, I'll usually build that for them. And I'm the primary facilitator of like the launch workshop, the coach training, that kind of a thing. They have a back end role of doing some program operation stuff, which I show them how to do. So they already are starting to take and learn how to run on the back end, a lot of these things, but they're learning a ton by osmosis, going through the process of customizing, going through the process of designing the actual micro experiences themselves, determining who should and shouldn't be in a program like this. I'm educating them a lot, and they're picking up a whole lot. That's why that's really the first step of the bigger certification process, is to start with a program that I design and deliver for them. And then if they want to go on and become certified, the second step is for them to build it. I've got a 6-workshop series that I lead them through. It's a flipped classroom approach where I basically teach them everything they need to know, but they're actually building it now. They're designing the micro experiences themselves with really high touch feedback and coaching from me on how to make them stronger over time. But it's a program that they built. I would then deliver that. That would be the last time I would deliver it. They would watch. I would usually co-facilitate with them to help build their skills in delivery. And at that point, they're licensed to use all of my methods and IP and all that stuff to run, design, and develop unlimited micro experience programs if they get to that point, sort of in the process. And then I have some quality standards that, we all try to hit together as they get better.
Yeah. Interesting. That's cool. Like, so is there anything people can do, on their own? Is there any DIY? Like, is there a smallest thing that someone who is kind of a go-getter listening to this could try this week or next week that would help them think about forming new habits or behavior changes, or is the program rigor really required to make this work?
Yeah, there's a lot of things, and I have a whole separate presentation on how you can get started with micro experiences on your own, and a lot of sort of do's and don'ts. Really, the first thing is this mindset change of let's look at what we're actually doing, not just what we know to do, and what needs to change about what we're actually doing, and then convert those behaviors into what I call micro experiences that has certain specific requirements. You want to chunk an action, a behavior down into something that a person or a team can do in 45 minutes or less. That's the micro of micro experiences. And then it has to be something that's real work, some real action on the job, in the flow of work, not a simulated environment, not a role play in a classroom, not read this article, not watch this TED Talk. That's knowledge transfer. Do this thing. Have this difficult conversation with your customer. Run this type of a retro that meets these certain, quality controls, kind of a thing. And then, sort of unpack it and reflect on it. And so a micro experience has those two components. Micro, you can knock it out in 45 minutes or less. That helps with the scalability piece and fitting into the busy calendars, And then the experiential piece, meaning it has to be actually on the job, not in some simulated environment, not just knowledge transfer. It's a doing action kind of a thing. You can kind of think of a micro experience as the kind of things that great leaders do, your highest performers, highest impact players, the kind of things that they do that most people don't do. Those are often great, material for crafting a good micro experience. So you think about, we want to get better at Agile. We want to get better at retros. We want to get better at sprint planning. We want to get better at, you name it. You go, what do the best in the world do? And how can we chunk that down into micro pieces and then feed it to people, 45 minutes a week in terms of action, and go through this cycle to sort of operationalize that. My biggest lesson learned is that people assume when they hear that designing good quality micro experiences will be much easier than it actually turns out to be. And in my certification, I have them try their hand at it. And I hear it all the time. It's like, okay, I thought this would be really easy. This turns out to be a lot harder than I expected.
Yeah.
And that's a sort of a design skill that has its own sort of skill building and craft to it. It's really not an exaggeration to say that it's a sort of almost even like a PhD level design skill to do them well. If you're really wanting to do them with executives to be impactful, with very seasoned leaders, or to try to do it for, the really hard stuff like changing deeply rooted cultural norms, in an organization, that's where it requires the highest level of design skill to create micro experiences that have the most impact.
Makes sense. Yeah. So I'm getting that the devil's in the details. Like there's this rigor in the kind of, the way you approach these things that will greatly affect your outcome of employing this technique,
Yeah, but I wouldn't want to discourage anybody from trying. In fact, I want to encourage people to try because that's my whole approach is try first, do first, and then learn from that doing, And if you could use some more help, I've got some resources for that. But, for me, this is really linked to almost like a purpose and a passion for me because being a heavy student of what actually works to change behavior, there's programs out there that are amazing and they're pivotal and they're unforgettable and they really do change behavior in very lasting, sticky ways that are beneficial, make people's lives better, help them become better versions of themselves or help them unleash the power of their team, right? There are programs out there that consistently do that. They're just expensive. And so you can only give them to executives or high potentials or a very small percentage of people. And honestly, Dave, that really bothered me because it's this whole aspect of privilege. The people who get the highest quality development are the rare privileged few who can afford it. And that was an equity problem for me. And so for me, this is about democratizing development and, doing what I call deep development at scale and figuring out how to offer this to more people for the good of the world, right? To help people do what they want to do, to help teams accomplish more, their organizations, achieve their mission in life and the good they want to do in the world as a company. And so, no, I want to get this out there. I want to equip as many people and empower as many people as possible. So absolutely try it. Start to learn some of those details yourself. And if you need some help, give me a call.
That sounds great. I love this so much. It makes me reflect on my journey in L&D and where we got to when we met, just to kind of bring it full circle. I think we were doing macro experiences,
Yeah.
And I think, you know what I mean? Like, I think it worked when all the moons aligned in conjunction, right? And it was like everything kind of set up but it worked. It didn't scale, So we're going after much bigger, broader suites of behavior change too. But still, the essence is there, and I can't wait to find a client where we can jam on this together and bring this into our practice. Like, I'm definitely going to try this and probably be a real nuisance to you in the journey. So just tell me when. I'm making a public pay up sucker, right? I'm here for it. Cool. Well, look, so what's, I know you've got your consulting shingle out there. It's peaq.co. That's peaq.co. I will link that in addition to some of the resources you mentioned in the show notes. How do people engage with you in your work? Like,
just send me a note, Jimmy at peaq.co. Pretty simple. And that's on the website. But yeah, it usually starts with just an intro, an overview. I've got a standard deck that I, sort of walk people through some of what we talked about here, the introduction and what micro experience programs are all about and how we operationalize them. But it goes into more detail how you can get started and what kind of options you do have. But it all starts with a 25-minute overview and Q&A about this whole approach to help suss out whether or not it might be something that would work well for you or your team or your organization. We can usually cover a lot of ground in just 25 minutes and it's decide at that point whether it makes sense for us to keep talking.
Yeah, makes sense. Great. Awesome. Jimmy, I just love the approach. Just as a process kind of nerd and a learning nerd and all that. But more than that, I think the purpose behind it is something I can really get behind. So want to encourage everyone to check you out at peaq.co and get in touch with Jimmy. Thank you so much, Jimmy. Appreciate you being on the pod.
Loved it. Thank you. I love your questions, Dave. Enjoyed it.